Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to our webinar, But You Don't Look Jewish, Unpacking and Addressing Unconscious Bias. This webinar is part of our ongoing Jewish Women and Religious Freedom in Florida project. I want to give a very special thank you to our sponsor, the Jewish Women's Foundation of the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, for providing grant funding for this important project. I also want to acknowledge and thank all the members of the Florida Project Steering Committee, which I won't name, but they know who they are, and thank you, as well as all our co-sponsors tonight, the National Council of Jewish Women, Greater Miami Section, the Society for Humanistic Judaism, Congregation Beth Adam, Florida National Organization for Women, Temple Israel Orlando, Jewish Federation of Broward County Community Relations Council, and Florida Freedom to Read. And now, onto our program. I am very, very excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Sage, and I hope I say this right, Sage, correct me. Cassell-Rosenberg serves as the Jews of Color Program Manager at Keshet and leads with a unique perspective. Born and raised in Miami Beach, Sage is a non-binary and queer person of color from a Jewish Modern Orthodox background. Sage has led DEIB workshops and initiatives across the globe, driving transformative conversations on unpacking and addressing implicit bias, belonging, and fostering psychological safety. With a multifaceted approach informed by their passion to create stronger and more vibrant communities for marginalized folks, while also strengthening allies, Sage empowers individuals and organizations to navigate complex societal landscapes with empathy, understanding, and emotional intelligence. Sage, the stage is yours.
Well, I am honored to have the stage. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you guys could all be here. I'm going to share a little fun fact about me, but I'm feeling very grateful that each and every one of you is here right now. To go into a little bit more of my lore as a person, as mentioned, I was born and raised in Miami Beach, Florida, in the modern Orthodox / ultra Orthodox community, with my dad often joking that we were Lubov-ish, is what we like to say. And this is something where, as a person of color, right, I maneuvered those spaces oftentimes as one of the only, if not the only, person of color in these rooms, minus people that I was related to. And oftentimes before even starting the session, I love to just point out, why start a session, or title a session with a declarative statement, but you don't look Jewish? Why not just say, let's unpack and address unconscious bias in the Jewish community in order to create and foster places of belonging for all, right? That could be a really good and succinct way to sell this session that I'm giving, right? So why start off with a declarative statement, but you don't look Jewish? The reason for that is that there's this book that I started reading called One Day This Pain Will Be Useful to You by Cyrus Aaron, which is about the Black experience in America. And he shares that at one point or another, each and every Black person realizes that they are Black. For him, he noted that this was in the second grade when he got transferred to a different school. But for me, the fact that I am Black has been made very, very obvious, specifically in Jewish spaces, where oftentimes even my presence, even my mere just walking into the room is met with stares, it's met with questions, it's met with faces that are shocked, oftentimes faces that are afraid. In fact, I've had on multiple different occasions, I've been questioned by cops at services at temples that I worked at because I was working as a Jewish educator in their early childhood. But yet, because someone was so surprised to see a Black face, they immediately assumed I was a threat. So why I start off with, but you don't look Jewish, is oftentimes when hearing even just my name, Sage Cassell-Rosenberg. Rosenberg is my given born last name. And that within itself raises flags of, oh, I wouldn't expect someone like you to have the last name Rosenberg. And this is something that people both say in their body language, but also through the questions and things that they just mention to me that don't allow me to feel as a part of a community that I should feel as a birthright. Again, I didn't try McDonald's till the age of 18, But yet, I often say that my experience in the Jewish community is oftentimes that I am treated like a tourist within my own religion. And the thing is that this is not just my experience. This is the experience of a lot of marginalized people. And the root of it all does stem from unconscious bias. So the reason why I start off with this statement is because, one, it's the thing that oftentimes people are thinking when they first meet me, but also because I'm trying to get at a deeper point. What I want people to sit with, and no one put this in the chat. No one put this in the chat. What we are going to do with unconscious bias today is we are going to humanize it, okay? It's not this scary title to take ownership of. It is a human thing that we all have. But what I want us to sit with before we start off the session is, before I started talking, right? What were those questions that started circulating in your brain? Or even while I was talking, was there possibly questions of whether or not I converted to Judaism? Possibly I was adopted, right? And that's how I have the last name Rosenberg, and that's how I ended up being raised in the modern / ultra Orthodox community. Are you wondering possibly like, oh, maybe they found Judaism like later in life, or maybe one of their parent is Jewish and one of their parent isn't? When the actual answer to the question is that I was not adopted. Both of my parents are Jewish, right? And my last name just is Rosenberg, the same way that all of your last names are just what they are. So with that, I want to go ahead and dive into the actual session. So if it will allow me to switch, there we go, perfect. I was worried for a second that it was going to freeze. Little fun fact, I am not the most tech savvy, but we are going to roll through the punches. But I wanted to start off the session with some kavanot, which is Hebrew for intentions. Starting off with, we are all human. I have unconscious biases, right? I, as a Black person, also have racist thoughts that occasionally pop into my brain. But because I have the self-awareness, I know not to articulate them. But that doesn't eliminate the fact that the thought existed in the first place. And yes, I am a person of color. And yes, I do experience racism, but that doesn't mean I can't also perpetuate racism. Just because I am someone who educates on unconscious bias doesn't mean that I don't have my own unconscious biases. So I'm not starting off the session being like, as a marginalized individual, as a Black, trans, Jewish person of color, and by the way, all my identities, remember them because there might be a test later, right? But yes, with all of those identities, I'm not speaking from the place that I am now allowed to talk about this because I'm holier than thou and I'm just talking down from my like little stage. No, I am amongst everyone. This is just a human experience. I'm continuously working on this. Through doing these sessions, I've even gotten better with my own unconscious bias. And we're able to do that if we enter into the session with a growth and learning mindset. So to give a quick example of what a growth and learning mindset is essentially there's two types of mindsets you can have with something. It's either your performance mindset or there's a growth and learning mindset. A performance mindset is I did good or bad, right? It's, oh my God, let's say, pretend you're in a play, you walk off stage and you're like, oh my God, I messed up that one line in that one song and I really wanted to hit it and the entire performance was terrible. I'm going to feel awful about how I did because of one moment where I did poorly, right? Versus a growth and learning mindset where instead you can look at the full picture, which is in the context of what we're talking about, which is the full picture is we are wonderful human beings who are just trying our darndest, right? We are just trying our best. But we have areas for growth. We have areas where we might struggle, right? So it's not black or white where I want you to walk away being like, oh, I'm racist or I'm not racist or I'm not biased and I'm not or whatever. That's not what I'm hoping to get from this. I'm not trying to point fingers and say you're this. I'm saying this might be something you're experiencing, but let's work on it together. And with that, and also my cat is Kitten. She's going through her first heat. If you hear cat, she's fine. She's completely fine. She's just being very vocal. But anyways, so in terms of taking space and making space is essentially give and take. I want us to share, right? I want us to have opportunities for me to share. I also want to have opportunities for y'all to share. Again, this is going to be structured out where this is normally a program I give in about an hour and a half, but we're condensing it to a little bit less than that. So towards the end, there will be an opportunity for questions, but in the chat, which I won't be able to notice at the same time, but feel free to put some of your experiences. Who knows who else will be able to relate to them? So again, to that note, take lessons, leave stories, right? Next is trust, intent, tend, impact. This one I really want to focus on because it's a huge theme of what ends up being harmful towards others. Because oftentimes intent is, I want to get to know this person better, right? And so this person approaches me and says, how are you Jewish, right? Their intent was they wanted to get to know me better. Their impact is, as a Jewish person who just wants to be treated like any other Jew. And again, I get to walk side by side with my white Jewish husband who gets to just walk in and sit down while I oftentimes and most often not don't get that opportunity. So someone approaching me the second I walk in through the door being like, oh my God, you're Jewish? what I'm feeling is I don't think I belong here because someone's treating me like I don't, right? But again, the intent was to get to know me better. The impact was harm, right? So what we're going to work on together is trying to figure out how we can get our intent to match the impact that we're trying to have, and having our intent planned out in an intentional way. So that way, without us meaning to, again, like you didn't mean to misgender someone, but you accidentally did, right? Your intent wasn't to harm that person. It was an accident. Accidents happen, right? To be human is to err. But yet the impact was harmful. So it's working together to figure out how we can match those two to be with our intent. And next, we're going to have some fun. I'm a silly person. I might drop a curse word here and there. I apologize. I'll try my best to refrain. Sometimes when I speak passionately, it just happens. But again, we are going to learn together. This is, again, not a thing where I want people to feel like, again, I'm pointing at you and saying, how dare you? This is something where I want us to learn. I want us to love. I want us to grow and laugh and all of those fun things. So going into specifically some of our goals for our session, and I'm just double checking that you guys can see the word goals because my screen kind of cut it off. We can see goals? Okay, perfect. So our first goal is I want to build common definitions of unconscious bias and allyship, meaning I don't want to just tell it to you. I want to build those understandings together. And as a collective, we're like, yeah, that sounds right. Next, I want us to reflect on our own unconscious biases and identify areas for personal growth and development, not thinking in a performance way where, oh my God, this means I'm racist because I said this, versus there's moments and times where I could have done something I didn't mean to do, but I can get better, right? So that's approaching allyship with a growth mindset. And here is said wild kitten doing her thing. Next, we're going to approach allyship from a framework of authentic relationship with accountability to historically marginalized people, meaning shifting from performative allyship, which is just, words, versus actionable allyship, which is actually something that the person who you're trying to support can point at and say, this is an opportunity where they could be an ally and were. Next, we're going to recognize some of the ways that biases pop up in a multitude of places, that being gender, sexual orientation, race and ethnic identities, and how that can impact historically marginalized folks. And then after that, we're going to start to identify how we can grow and also how we then can be allies for others. Because one of my goals for these sessions, and it's not something I'm listing here because it's my own goals, is I want to leave y'all prepared to be agents of change within your own community, because we have an opportunity as individuals to make more of a difference than we give credit for. You never know the one moment that you say, hey, I don't know if you should have said that to that person, what that ripple effect can be. Because I have so many small moments of people doing things that I doubt they remember, but they stood out to me as a moment where someone was an ally to me. So to jump straight into definitions, this one I think is the most important. So there's a common phrase now where it's DE&I, education, diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And what folks have started doing is including on the letter B, which is belonging. And I want to give context for the fact that all of these things together, diversity and inclusion, are not inherently synonymous with belonging. Just because you have a diverse organization, just because you are making efforts to either make your organization more diverse or keep your organization more diverse, does not mean that there is a feeling of belonging. Oftentimes, what I like to say is that diversity, that's a head count, right? The numbers are what they are. It literally is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or sometimes just 1, whatever it is. And inclusion, that's just an action. That is an action that you are taking to try to increase the amount of diversity. But belonging is a feeling, and it's a feeling that needs to be nurtured and nourished, right? And it can't be inherently there. I'll share a very quick story from my childhood that really emphasizes this point. When I was 9 years old, it was Purim, and I walked with my mom to synagogue. For context, my mom is my Black parent and my father is my white parent. And we were walking to synagogue, right? And it was Purim. So what's something we commonly do on Purim? Right? We wear costumes, right? That's like the number one thing people think about. We wear costumes. I saw someone do this with like a grogger. Yes, we do that as well. I noticed that. But right, so I'm walking because again, I was raised Orthodox, so I'm not driving to the synagogue. I'm walking. So I'm walking to synagogue, and I don't know if I actually had specifically had for Purim. I forget if maybe there was a yontiv or overlap of some kind. But for this one specifically, I was with my mother. We were in costume, added to the fact that because I am trans and I was assigned female at birth, I was socialized as a girl until, I realized that I wasn't one. And this was something where I was also dressed modestly, as was my mom. We were in costume, dressed modestly. Something else that also happens very frequently on high holidays, and I also understand the need for it, is there's added security. because we're worried that the fact that it's a high holiday might bring more attention to us as a Jewish people as a marginalized group, right? Because of this, as I'm approaching the front door, I'm 9 years old. I'm about to walk into a synagogue that I've been going to since before I have cognitive memories, right? We know that type of synagogue where it's like, I've just been there. I just remember being there. And as we are walking into the front door, the security officer or the police officer specifically, what he does, he goes, we're trying to walk in, and he goes, oh, throws his hand in front and goes, I'm sorry, you guys can't come in. It's only for Jews tonight. And I'm 9, right? I'm 9. My entire worldview is just Judaism. I didn't even have any non-Jewish friends. I didn't have a world outside of the modern / ultra-Orthodox Chabad-ish community that I was a part of. But yet at 9, I'm being stopped at the door and told that the synagogue that I'd been going to since before I had cognitive memories, I wasn't able to enter in from because I was not, they assumed, not Jewish. In that moment, I don't think I had a full understanding of what racism was. I understood the fact that, like, when kids would call me the N-word in Yiddish, that was an example of racism. But things like these microaggressions, I couldn't comprehend. But I remember that being a key memory for me, because I remember that whenever, because most commonly, my mom really didn't go to synagogue that often. She went on the high holidays, she went on specific holidays, and that was it. She normally was at home preparing the meal. And I would typically, if I had to go to services, would walk with my white dad, who fit the part, right? He had a long beard, he had the kippah, he has this seat, right? He has the black and white suit, even though it's Miami and 90 something degrees outside. And I remember thinking, this never happens when I walk in with Tati, but it always happens when I walk in with Mom. And that was a moment at 9 where I had to wrap my head around the idea that there was something about me that made me have less access to a space that should have been my birthright. So why I use this story as an example of diversity, inclusion versus belonging is because our synagogue was factually more diverse because our family was a part of it. They factually were doing inclusive things by sending us the email that everyone gets, letting them know, hey, we're doing something for the holidays, come on by. But yet, that feeling of belonging, how is that supposed to be there if at the door we're told we don't belong there? So that's why I really try to focus on this, because having diversity, like, great. Focusing on diversity initiatives, awesome. Inclusion efforts, great. Equity, love it. But belonging, that is something that needs to be intentionally and continuously nourished. So going into specifically more of our definitions, because again, I want to build these together. What does it mean to be an ally? What is allyship? So the process of being in a relationship, allyship is the process of being in a relationship with people who hold a marginalized identity that you do not share, and using your own platform, privilege, although I do not like this word, and we'll circle back to why I don't like this word and what word I like instead of privilege, or power to work with them to increase safety, dignity, and belonging for members of that group. Notice that allyship does not say, I have Black friends, I have a trans child, I have a coworker who's LGBT. Notice that it doesn't say, I care about this group. Notice how it doesn't say, I love this group. Notice how it doesn't say, I don't have a problem with this group. Notice how it's action-oriented, because allyship is action-oriented. It's accountable and it's ongoing. And it also may look different from situation to situation. For instance, most people, if they get misgendered, it is a good allyship practice to correct the person and say, this is their pronouns. Fun fact about me, I actually don't like when other people correct my pronouns for me. So that actually would be an example where, again, allyship is something that I hate that it's a little bit of a guessing game, but it's something where you have to remember that there's individuals within the marginalized groups that you're trying to support. And also what I want to add is that it's not that the Jewish community is allies to the Black community, the Asian community, the et cetera, the LGBT community. The Jewish community has Black Jews. The Jewish community has Asian Jews. The Jewish community has LGBTQ Jews. So this is not allyship to outside communities. This is allyship to the members of our community who identify within these marginalized groups. So then what we're also going to talk about is intervention specifically. And what is the best way to be an ally in this moment? Because again, it can be a little bit like, okay, well, it's not, being an ally is for a group that I'm not a part of. How do I know what they need? How do I know how to be a good ally? And what if I get it wrong? But that's where we circle back to the fact that allyship is ongoing, right? And circling back also to the growth versus performance mindset. There could be times where you learn from a time where you could have been a better ally. And in that moment, yes, maybe you messed up, but if you turn it as a learning opportunity for how you can do better next time, the fact that sometimes it can feel like a little bit of a guessing game is it's less detrimental to how you feel as an individual, because you are also important in this. Allies also deserve TLC for themselves while also giving TLC and actionable allyship to others. So now we're going to the meat of it, which is unconscious bias. So what is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias is also known as implicit bias. Unconscious bias is essentially a learned assumption, belief, or attitude that exists in the subconscious, right? That keyword unconscious. But what I like to say is that unconscious bias is one of the best things our brains do. It's literally one of the most helpful things our brains do. And this is the part where people's eyebrows start to raise and they're like, well, what does Sage mean by unconscious bias is good? What unconscious bias is on like a biological level, right? Like if we're looking at our brain, essentially unconscious bias is our brain making mental shortcuts, right? So that way we don't have to think about each and every decision. If we didn't have unconscious bias, going to a grocery store would be a nightmare, right? Because we would have to walk in and look at each and every product on the shelf. We'd probably be there until after closing or even till the next day, with employees being like, oh my God, just pick a box of cereal, please. But yet, because we have our unconscious bias, we walk into the store already knowing things that we like, things that we don't like, brands that we regularly buy, brands that, oh, I've been interested in trying this, right? So our unconscious bias actually makes decisions making a lot easier. Where it's harmful is when our unconscious bias can be looped into harmful either rhetorics or different stereotypes, or make us have assumptions about individuals that we don't know, but maybe our only exposure has been through the media. Maybe this is their first time ever meeting a Black trans Jew. If it is, don't feel alone. That's a lot of people's audiences I go to. It's their first time, so that's fine, and I'm honored. But this is something where, because you've never met someone like me, it's possible that you have like, okay, well, I know this about trans people, I know this about Black people, so maybe this is something about them. And that's where it gets to be harmful. And that's why we want to start addressing it. So starting off, what I want us to actually do is we're going to play a quick game. I don't want to stop sharing just in case I end up messing up everything afterwards. So I'm going to try to frame you guys more. We are going to play a very quick game where you're just going to raise your hand for the option that agrees with you, right? The one rule about this game is, the literal one rule is, you are not allowed to think. There's not allowed to be a thought that enters into your brain. And in fact, I'm going to make it very difficult for you to think, because I'm going to be talking at the same time as I'm asking the questions. I'm moving very quickly. So don't think about it. Just answer your hands accordingly. Okay, so we're starting off. First one is, you're going to have to pick your preference. Imagine we're at a grocery store, right? And starting off, Coke or Pepsi? Raise your hand if you would like Coke. Raise your hand if you like Pepsi. Okay, that's one. All right, now the next one. Again, no thinking. Iced coffee versus hot coffee. Raise your hand if you like iced coffee. Raise your hand if you like hot coffee. Okay, now this one is very divisive, but we got to get to it. So dogs versus cats. Okay, raise your hand if you are a dog person. Raise your hand if you're a cat person. You know what? Everyone is lovely and will love and accept you unconditionally no matter what. So what that was an example of, and why I like to play this game, is that in each and every question I asked, your unconscious bias popped up. Let's start off with the first one. And also my unconscious bias popped up. I realized as I was talking on my third one that I kept on giving the option that I like best first. Because I liked Coke, right? In the Coke and Pepsi debate, I like Coke better. In iced coffee versus hot coffee, I'm a sucker for iced coffee. And in terms of dogs versus cats, I'm a dog person. I love my cat dearly, though. I still love her. I just factually am a dog person. I do not have the capacity to take care of a dog right now, but cats are lovely. But what I wanted to show that as an example of is that the Coke and Pepsi one is a perfect example of where our unconscious bias pops up. Did we choose Coke? Did I choose Coke because I like the taste better than Pepsi? Or is it possible that growing up, that was the brand that my mom bought growing up, or whoever was buying it? Again, my unconscious bias that my mom was the one who always did groceries. If possible, my dad did some at some point. And this is something where, as I was growing up, and every time I opened the fridge, I saw Coca-Cola. As an adult, when I started going to the grocery store myself, was I just trying to get this exact same thing, creating the exact same image of what I had as a child? That is an example of an unconscious bias. And it's an example of when unconscious bias is not harmful, right? Who does it really hurt if you like Coke versus Pepsi, right? Maybe some feelings for some people who might feel passionate about the two. But other than that, it's just factual things that our brain does in order to answer questions quickly. You didn't have the time to think about all the training I was doing of like, oh, which one is it? Do I have this because I'm a child? Blah, 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 blah. No, I just asked a question quickly and you answered. So that's an example of how unconscious bias is present in all of our minds and at any given times and at places we don't expect. Separate game, this is the Sage Squared conundrum. So this, you already know my name, so it's easier to get the answer right for this one. But this is my friend Sage Jackson, and then on the other side is myself, Sage Rosenberg. Sage and I are friends, and we are also people who did acting gigs together. So we were often in groups where people would have to call our name out. And I will say, not even 99% of the time, I'm just going to say 100% of the time, there was assumed that Sage Jackson was Sage Rosenberg, and I was Sage Jackson, right? And the thing is that I like to say about this particular thing is that I could easily be offended, but I'm going to paint a random thought experiment, right? If I was placed in this like thought experiment and I was told I would get $2 million, $2 million if I could guess the Jew, and I'm like, perfect, I'm Jewish, let's go, right? And I was given these two photos, and let's imagine the situation I'm not the person in that photo, right? And this is the time when I'm talking about my own experience with me being racist, because this is exactly what I'm talking about. And this is an opportunity where I would also say that. But again, in this thought experiment, if this was not a photo of me and I was asked to pick who I thought was Jewish, I would look at my friend and I would say, well, they're wearing a wig, which is very similar to a lot of the women growing up that I had, right? They're even wearing modest clothing, kind of more monotones. And then the person on the other side has a lot of attributes that I don't really commonly associate with what it means to look Jewish. They have piercings, I can see tattoos, and they're Black, and I don't really know that many Black Jews. And I would even say that as my own self. And again, everything I'm saying, problematic, right? That I'm articulating my own unconscious bias for what it means to be Jewish. But I really want to emphasize the fact that like, I am not holier than thou. If I was placed in this thought experiment and it wasn't me in that photo, and there was $2 million on the line if I guessed correctly, I know how I would guess, right? But what that guess also leads is that I myself has unconscious bias. But I also wanted to kind of discuss with what that looks like where does unconscious bias essentially like fill out, right? There can be context matters. Unconscious bias applies to every single section of what it means to be human. For instance, like disability health, like either assuming what people can and can't do when they disclose that they are disabled. Race, I've mentioned things like that as well, ethnicity and culture. For instance, to give an example of gender and how that pops up for people's unconscious bias is when people meet me in person, 95% of the time, they assume that I'm male. When people listen to me on the phone, 99.9% of the time, they assume I'm female. The interesting thing about that is that when I'm in person, people still hear me because I talk a whole lot. Professional yapper right here. I talk a bit, right? So people can hear my voice, right? But because they physically can see me, they can see my rest attributes, and they decided, okay, maybe they have a feminine sounding voice, but they look like what I assume a man to look like. So I'm going to assume that they're a man. But yet the person on the phone who only has my voice to work off and their own unconscious bias for what genders sound and act like, right? They're like, okay, I just have the voice and the voice sounds like what I assume most women sound like. So this must be a woman I'm talking to. And then I surprise them when I show up to the doctor's office. But anyhow, outside of that, the ways that this can also be very harmful is in terms of we're thinking about like expectations for success. Like, for instance, if we're thinking about the fact that like stereotypically women are promoted less than men in the workplace. And it's not things based off of how like work, like actual attributes or history of success or capabilities or education. In fact, there are stereotypically more men who are promoted with less of these things than women have in the work field because of people's unconscious biases towards women and how it relates to gender. Thinking of how unconscious bias, the top ways that unconscious bias lurk in most organizations, it's things like the gender bias, like assuming that, oh, someone's who's upset is just being emotional because of X, Y, Z, because I have a gender bias between how women act, or an assertive woman being assumed to be the B word, because even though that would be completely fine if a man was doing it, but because a woman's doing it and not catering to being the nice, pleasant, I'm not going to rock the boat, all of a sudden that person is labeled the B word and is not promoted because they are difficult to deal with. And that is harmful. Ageism is another way that it can be harmful in organizations. For instance, I'm Gen Z. I am so bad with technology. I am awful with technology. However, if I were to be put up for, I don't know, like a position at a comms for a communications team, right? me against someone who's maybe in an older age demographic than me, they would assume, like specifically in the 55 plus range, they would assume that most likely in terms of having to deal with technology, they're like, oh, Sage is a Gen Z, is going to be the perfect person for the job, I'm assuming. And this other person, there's no way they're up to the speed enough because like, oh, that generation was spoon-fed technology from birth, which we were. And yeah, but at the same time, that's just not based off of any attributes that I've shown, right? I haven't displayed that I'm good with technology. Someone's just taking a look at me and saying that's a young face versus someone else who's older than me and saying that two faces I'm seeing must mean their abilities are X, right? We also have things like beauty bias, where according to how attractive you are in the workplace or an organization, people might be more eager to be friends with you, might be more eager to invite you to talk places. If the flip side happens, people might be a little discouraged to maybe choose you for the interview, which is again harmful because you still have a bunch to say. You could be more qualified than the person who just looks pretty on the poster. And also me saying just looks pretty on the poster might assume that that pretty person doesn't also have a beautiful brain accompany them. So that's my own moment where I'm saying an unconscious bias. But this is another time where, again, based off of just attributes that someone has and not their actual talents, people box them in. Oh, I didn't mean to go back yet. I'm gonna have to switch these kind of quickly because I do want to get to the next section. But the halo and horn effect is essentially what it sounds like. Someone does one thing good, one thing bad, and you're then constantly eager to feed into your confirmation bias. Your confirmation bias is, I already think this thing, and now I'm looking for things that confirm it. It's kind of like when you have a red car, all of a sudden you notice red cars more. So it's like the same way where unconscious bias could be feeding, like for instance, your actual consciousness could be like feeding you all these fun facts about a certain person, right? But your confirmation bias that maybe on the first day they met you, they looked messy. So your horn effect bias is like, this is a disorganized person, is forever going to think of that person as disorganized just because they had a messy shirt. And even though they maybe have many other areas that they excel at in terms of being highly organized, and maybe they just spilled something on themselves, that 2 months later, they come into your office again and they're like, you know what? This is a problem in the office, your disorganization. So that's an idea of confirmation bias. I'm going to kind of skip conformity bias, but it's what it sounds like, which is like the feeling to conform to other people because you think, oh, if other people are doing this, then this must be correct, right? And that's oftentimes how like microaggressions can happen. You're like, oh, no one said anything, so it must not have been racist. I must have been mistaken. Then lastly, we have affinity bias. Affinity bias is kind of like the lunchroom conundrum. You're walking in, you're anxious where to sit, so you try to look for people who you think might have in common with you. You know what I mean? Is someone like, for instance, you're like, oh, I walk in and I'm nervous because I'm only seeing white faces. And all of a sudden I see one brown person and I'm like, this is now the person I'm going to sit with because I have an affinity bias. And again, affinity bias can also be a natural, again, tribalism is a very natural feeling. It's comforting psychologically to be with people who share things with you. But when it ends up being harmful is that within affinity bias, we end up creating these in-groups, which is what it sounds like people are in our tribe, and out-groups, which are people outside of our tribe, which could end up leading to being like, oh, I don't really want to ask them any questions because I'm not sure, blah, 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 blah. And then this person ends up feeling alienated. And that's all because you're just too scared to meet someone who's different than you and spend time with. So now I want to go into some examples, like specific examples, because I talked about this intent versus impact and trying to match them. So I want to give some examples for times when the intent is something that's not harmful, but the impact was. So starting off, and this is one of the most popular compliments that I get after giving a talk, and now that I've included it, it happens less. But very often after I am done speaking, people will say something along the lines of, I was surprised by how well spoken you were. Notice that they're not saying you did so well. Notice they're not saying you spoke so great. Notice how they're not saying you're so articulate. They are saying, I was surprised by how well spoken you were. That keyword being surprised, right? Because again, their intent when they're coming over to me is not, I want this person to feel bad, right? Their intent is to give me a compliment because they thought I did a great job and they want to let me know. Their impact is, I didn't expect someone like you to be able to talk so well. Because when I say surprise, I'm like, well, they already introduced me and said all of these things that I've done, the fact that I used to manage an education company that focused on teaching emotional intelligence and unconscious bias. I've given talks to every single continent besides Antarctica. So the surprise part, where is the surprise? The surprise is what I look like and being surprised that someone who looks like me can talk like I do. Next one, specifically looking at how this looks in Jewish environments is, so which side of your family is Jewish? Which parent is Jewish? And this is a question where the intent is someone's excited, and people have said this with the biggest smile on their face. They're so excited that a queer Jew of color is felt comfortable coming to the space, and they come over to me because they're the welcoming committee, or they just want to make sure I feel okay and that someone talked to them, and they're excited to learn more about me. But what I hear as someone with two Jewish parents who was born Jewish and was not adopted is, I don't think you're fully Jewish or as Jewish as I am, and I'm trying to figure out how you're connected to Judaism. Because notice how, again, it's another one, which is, I would have never guessed you were Jewish. What I hear is I have a set image of what it means to look Jewish, and that doesn't include you. And what's so really harmful about this is what's happening in the same way that I articulated that I can be of a race and still racist towards my race or other races, we can be Jewish and still perpetuate anti-Semitism, right? By thinking that someone who looks different, keeping in mind that like you could travel to any country and there's a Chabad somewhere, okay? You could travel to the middle of nowhere and you could find a Jew, right? And understanding that one, and also common times people are like, oh, an entire department for LGBTQs of you see, it's a mouthful, I know. LGBTQ plus JOC Jews of color. You mean just there's more than just you? And I like to say the first thing I love to interject is think about Israel. And then all of a sudden people remember that brown Jews exist. And that's one of those moments where I want to say, like, this is not just beneficial for me. This is not just beneficial for other folks like me. This is beneficial to you, because that means if you were to say something like, I'm surprised that Sage is Jewish, I'm surprised that Sage was raised in the modern Orthodox community, you yourself might be holding on to a little bit more anti-Semitism than you give yourself credit for. And it's up to us to be able to take and stop those rhetoric with us, because who are we to continue spouting things that are really from the mouth of our oppressors? So let's not. And I want to end off with one last one, which I'm realizing now in the train of how I did this, like thematically, that one should have been my last talking point, but I do want to add this last one, which is, I bet you have an amazing singing voice, because the first two, what they are is what I like to call nice racism. They're compliments. They're compliments. The person's approaching me to compliment me, but in their compliments, they're being really racist. Fun fact, I have a terrible singing voice. I don't know why I've been invited to sing, like when I was in Jewish day school, I always got asked to do like the choir. They're like, oh my God, we have to get Sage to sing. And then I would sing with as poorly as I could. And I realized in that moment, I'm like, why do so many people think I can sing? That's such an odd thing. Like, I've never heard of someone constantly being assumed that they can sing. And then I realized, I was like, oh, because there's the image of the Black church singer who has the amazing voice, right? So what I hear when I hear, oh, I bet you have an amazing voice, which again is a compliment, is I think I know facts about you because of a visible identity you have that I have an unconscious bias towards. So what we are seeing through all of these is, again, the intent was to be nice. All of these things, the person who was saying it, if I was about to say, I'm like, if my first response was, how dare you? The person would be so confused. They're like, what do you mean? I'm just trying to compliment you. I thought you did amazing. I'm just curious to know more. But the reaction is because I know the message, right? And it's important for us to identify these things. So that's where I ask people to double check your curiosity. Is your need to know questions about my background so important that it's worth my psychological safety being removed, my feelings of belonging being removed? Also, is there ways to ask about people's backgrounds like you would anyone else? I notice when people are just like, oh, where are you from? As the first question versus, oh, where are your parents from? Which is also the first question I get very commonly. I'm realizing I have a lot less time than I figured, and I want to skip over this, but keep in mind, double check your curiosity, okay? Think about that a little bit. So now I want to go into what specifically a microaggression is, and I'm going to use this quote to kind of say it from Pierre Caravot, is, be as careful with a minor mitzvah as with the major one, for you do not know the reward. This is a positive phrase, right? It's saying that, like, you don't know how big of a return you can get on your investment for this mitzvah, but it's also perfect for microaggressions, because oftentimes things like, oh, people are like, oh, I didn't mean that, you're just being sensitive, and they'll downplay it. But what I often like to say is that sometimes microaggressions hit on a macro scale, right? Someone being not sure if I was Jewish, right? And asking security to ask me a few questions, right? They could view that as, oh, that was just a mess up, I'm sorry. But it ended up impacting the fact that at a place that I worked, at my Jewish temple, I ended up being questioned by the cops for doing absolutely nothing. So that's why it's important to think about microaggressions. And just to give a quick definition, microaggressions are defined as the everyday, subtle, intentional, but I often say most often unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias towards historically marginalized groups. So something like, I was surprised by how well you spoke, that's a microaggression. Saying, I didn't think Black people could, that's a macroaggression. So just in a quick snapshot, that's the example of the differences between those two, because I do want to have y'all have that working understanding together. So this slide just quickly talks about the fact that, where is it? That it actually ends up living on the body on a physical level, where these microaggressions over time end up including things like symptoms of anger, depression, anxiety, lack of sleep, headaches, increased blood pressure. So these microaggressions specifically, not macro, have actually been studied to be able to have actual damage and impact and trauma to the body for those who experience it. So now this is really important, and this is where I want to talk about why I don't like the word privilege. The reason I don't like the word privilege is because it's a very, just like the same way that I don't like performance mindset, which is black and white thinking of I did good or bad. Privilege is either I have privilege or I don't have privilege, right? And I think within that statement of privilege, it erases what could be someone's childhood, what can be someone's struggle, what could be someone's place before they got to the place that someone's calling them privilege. And what I often like to say to kind of prove this point is I am in the state of Florida, I live in the state of Florida, right? As a Black, trans, Jewish person, I am highly privileged. And this is another moment where all the eyebrows go up. Why do I say I'm highly privileged? Because I have reliable income. I'm not worried about my rent. I have housing security. I have food on my table, right? I have amazing access to community. I have a job with amazing benefits where I get to talk about my Jewish, Black, queer experience. Like that's dream job, quelling for a quick second. These are all ways that I am privileged, but yet someone would be like, oh, because I am Black, because I am this, I'm not privileged. And it's removing the complexity of the situation of the fact that, like, yes, I am a Black person, but I'm also a light-skinned Black person. Also, fun fact, you can't see this, I'm 4'11". I am not very threatening, but yet someone who is also Black, who is considerably taller than me and much darker than me, is statistically more likely to have issues with cops than I do. There was one time I talked myself out of a ticket. I'm not going to mention it, but again, the person said, you seem like a nice kid, right? Because my appearance is not threatening. So instead of privilege, what I actually like to say is at an advantage or a disadvantage, right? Because you could be at one moment at an advantage, right? For instance, the moment where I could be at an advantage is the fact that I'm not worried about my next meal. The moment I could be at a disadvantage is sometimes or oftentimes when I'm getting ready for services and I'm putting on my suit, I'm worried that this is the time that I'm going to get stopped by the cops, because on average it happens 1 in 3 times. So if that's not something that you've ever thought about when getting dressed to go to synagogue, then that's a moment that you're at an advantage over me. However, if we're talking about security, right? On the high holidays, having anxiety as a Jewish person that something bad could happen, that is you at a disadvantage to other people, right? That is us all collectively as Jews feeling the anxiety that we're rightfully feeling at a moment where we are all collectively at a disadvantage. So being able to just throw out the term privilege and not privilege doesn't make any sense. Saying that we have advantages in certain moments and disadvantages at a different moment, that makes sense. And that's where I like to say that that's the most important part of allyship, is identifying the spots where you have an advantage and then using your advantage in order to help someone who's currently at a disadvantage. So the quote that I would quickly say is, every time you go through something and it's easy for you, look around and say, who is it not easy for? And what can I do to dismantle that system? And that dismantling the system, that's not a big giant, like we're ripping it down and we're starting it anew. That could be saying like, hey, why wasn't that person considered for that speaking opportunity we had? Right? It's things like that. So to quickly kind of wrap up, because I want to make sure we have time for questions, my keys, my like key things for acting against implicit bias is, first and foremost, it starts with self-awareness by practicing self-reflection. In order to know the beast that you're fighting, you need to introduce yourself to the beast and get to know them a little bit better, right? If you're just, because then you're just aiming at the dark. You don't know the abilities of this beast. You don't know what they have, what they believe, what their drive is. So by doing that, you can make yourself more aware of your own biases and fears, remembering that we all have them. We all have biases. I remember the first time I ever met an Asian Jew, this was something when I was 16 years old. I remember thinking, I wonder if they converted. I wonder if one of their parents is Jewish. And in that moment, those were questions I hate answering. But because I had never met an Asian Jew before, even as someone with that experience, I realized my own unconscious bias was popping up, but yet I had the self-awareness to know not to ask, right? Because with my lived experiences, I was able to have the awareness that even though I'm having these questions where I'm curious to know how this person's connected to Judaism, I know not to ask because I know what that feels like. But if we don't have that opportunity to know directly what that feels like, the most important thing for limiting your own unconscious bias is seeking out interactions from people who differ from you. This does not mean turning people into a pamphlet when you meet them. This does not mean treating an individual like a Google search bar with no feelings, thoughts, emotions, or triggers. This means seeking out education. This means joining talks like this. Like you doing this right now is literally exactly what I recommend people to do. Because again, I'm a Black, queer, Jew of color. If you are not those things, then you're learning about these lived experiences I have, which then you can store in your brain. And from there, it's practice empathy by listening and making space for others' lived experience. Exactly like this, inviting people to talk from a different experience than other people might have, educating, whatever that may be, or just listening, hearing someone out when they tell you about this awful situation that happened. And next is try not to get defensive in approach. When you mess up, let's say you messed up someone's pronouns, saying, I'm sorry, that's what you should do. Being, I'm so sorry, but I know that I care about you so much and I love you so much and I have a trans child and I blah, 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 blah. That section, that defense, that's for you because you feel bad. That's you self-soothing yourself in this moment. So it's important to remember to not get defensive and to say, I'm sorry, and I'll try to do better next time. And that is holding yourself accountable, right? By holding yourself accountable, you're open to the fact that you are not a person. You're not I would hope you're a person, but you're not a perfect person, right? We are never going to be perfect individuals. We never want to be static, right? We never want to be static. We never want to just be flatline for the rest of our life, right? We want to be on an uphill journey. So in order to be on that uphill journey, you have to acknowledge that you are on an uphill journey. And that uphill journey is you each step of the way getting a little bit better. And that's where it's also important when you're getting better to actually be an ally, right? These are opportunities you have for growth, for learning, but also to show solidarity for those who really, really need and deserve it. I'll quickly go over it. I promise this is then the last slide, which is almost about perfect, which is my 4 A's for allyship. And it just ties in some of the lessons we've already talked about, which is, again, it's awareness, both internal and external. It's acknowledgement, which is acknowledging the fact that you might have things you need to work on, that other people might have things they need to work on, that maybe you witnessed something happen to a marginalized person. And maybe in that moment, you didn't know how to be a good ally. Well, guess what? Being a good ally doesn't stop in the moment. It continues after. If you notice something and you don't know how to support that person without possibly causing harm, right? Afterwards, check in and say, hey, I saw that interaction. Are you feeling okay? Because in that moment, that's being an ally. You're giving the opportunity for a processing space. You're giving the opportunity for someone to feel like they're supported in that moment. So just because you don't know in that moment how to be a perfect ally doesn't mean that you can't learn afterwards. Doesn't mean you can't be an ally after the exact moment happens. And within that moment, you can be an ally by saying, I wish I could have done more in the moment, but I didn't know how. In the future, how would you like me to react? Right? Because that's a moment where you're showing accountability, right? You're not saying, oh my God, I'm sorry if I didn't do X, Y, and Z and making it about yourself. Instead, you're acknowledging that didn't know what to do in the moment, but I did know I wanted to support you. So that's why it's important for me after it happened to know that you know that I do support you, but I'm also holding myself accountable to do better next time, right? And then in that learning of how to do better next time, that's where we take action. And I think I just want to end off on this Hebrew quote, which is essentially ties it all together, which is Kol Yisrael Avarim Ze Vazeh. All of Israel is responsible for one another, meaning in a community, when we see something, we say something because I belong to you, you belong to me, we belong to each other because that's what community is. And with that, I turn it over.
Sage, that was amazing. Thank you so much. You are very articulate and I love the presentation. What we're going to do, because it's a fairly small group, is rather than take questions by chat, if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll let you unmute yourself and you can ask your question. Be brave.
Yeah.
Sherry, go ahead. Oh,
Hi,
there you go.
thank you. First, I want to say that this was really excellent. I have taken multiple trainings on DEI and everything. And this one hit the mark for me in getting to some of the issues, particularly on microaggressions and getting to know somebody, where I think I never really understood why certain things people would say were microaggressions, why they were, and I understand that very clearly now. One of the things that I'm concerned about, and I'm wondering if you have a comment, is that in one of the trainings that I have to take every year, they talk about racism as being something that only the people in power can be. And it's always frustrating for me because I don't think that that's true. And I don't think that you think that's true, but I'd love to be able to address it in a good way. And also I noticed that in all the DEI trainings, with the exception of this one, nobody ever mentions Jewish people, ever. I've never been in one that has talked about Jewish people at any level. So even though this was how we as Jews should, help ourselves to grow, it's a first.
It shouldn't be, but I'm
Yeah.
happy that I could be that, because it deserves to be mentioned. It's a scary time right now for us.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so do you have any way to help to address only the group in power can be racist?
Yeah, no, I understand that. So in terms of that's something that I'm still grappling with, right? In terms of it, because this is not something I have as a fully baked idea in my brain. I personally come from the fact that anything where you're assigning blame tied to race specifically and only not seeing the individual, I do view as being a form of bigotry in all kinds. I think some of the definitions where people struggle with is that if we're talking about like the phenomenon of racism, which is what it's assigning specifically, like if you're thinking it from the lens of, oh, there's this ongoing phenomenon and then scientists need to give it a name specifically. So I think where the confusion for some people happen or the conflict happen is that this, in terms of a concept that was studied, where it pops up was through identifying things like the systemic differences between how, for instance, we'll just use the word like white versus people of color are being treated at the time period when they're discussing it. So that's where the original, like if it's like, oh, what did this mean when it was created? It is reflecting on the fact that it is something where has to be a systemic or a power balance between the two. But I push back saying that language evolves, right? And things change. And I think that the conversation surrounding whether or not, for instance, like that white people can experience some form of racism is something where I think within systems of power, it's rarely such a stark difference where the harm of being seen for specific attributes, for specifically having to be white, might be different from that of being black, but I don't think that it removes the ickiness of exactly like, oh, I assume that you must not know how to dance because you're white. That feels like an example of racism to me personally, but I know that it's not something to give a long answer short because I wanted to give my feedback. This is something that I'm still working on to see as a D&I educator, because I'm someone who loves to take in feedback from lived experiences. And so this is something where I'm still wrapping my head around. I'm like, well, technically, if we're talking about the phenomenon that racism was originally studying, then yes, according to that definition, it does apply in the way you were talking about. But if we're looking in now modern day life that we're at, where systems can be different, conversations can be different, power structures can be different, I think there's more nuances in that conversation, but I don't have like a final destination, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's a good way to get my brain rolling on it. Thank you.
We have time for one or two more questions. Marilyn.
Hi. I really enjoyed your speech, your talk, and I want to just add one observation. I've worked in the field with a lot of seniors and a lot of disabled people, and they get similar kinds of bias that a lot of people just ignore and diminish them right in front of them all the time. And I think it's another thing that we all need to work on, because there's, as you said, ageism, and because a person is blind, for instance, doesn't mean that they're less a person. So that's all.
No, thank you for sharing. That's when I said take lessons, leave lessons, like this is exactly what I meant.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak? Martha?
I have a question because you said the Jewish N word in my mind, or the Yiddish N word, and in my mind I'm going, what is she talking about? What is he talking about? What is happening here? And then I'm going, my grandmother, when she would say Schwarza.
Please don't
okay,
say that word to me. Please don't say
I'm
that word to
sorry.
me.
I mean,
Yeah.
my sister called me the actual N word, but it just, I would stop her. And this was 50 years ago. But if you don't look at the history of it, so I got into a group in Jacksonville, it's called 904 Word, and it's talking about racism. And I was like, all of a sudden, the Jewish person in the whole group. And they started telling me these stereotypical things that they really didn't like Jews because of X, Y, and Z. And because I'm over 70, I remember being in a different generation where, how would I put this? Where we were allies, right? It was a Jewish Black NAACP. But
Very
that's
cool.
changed. So it's tricky. The whole thing is very complicated. And I'm not going to say that the thing that I got from you today, Sage, is like not to question the person that's in the group that comes from Jamaica, whose complexion is the same as yours and mine. Like why, how, but I want inquiring. I love her, this is, I would like to figure this out. But I try not to say those things. So
Yeah.
racism is complicated.
Yeah, just for the interest of time, is it okay if I jump into the answer to your question?
Always.
Awesome. So just first, similar to the way that in society, and instead of saying the N-word, we just say the N-word, the similar type of landscape would apply in terms of saying that word, because I really, really do not like that word, as I was told that on a daily basis in the school that I went in. So I have the associations of it. That hurts more than the N-word does for me personally. So the best way to say would be the N-word in Yiddish, or an unflattering word for Black people in Yiddish. That's how it would be the best way to do that going forward. In terms of like how we talk about racism and stuff evolving, that's just the nature of the times. Things will always be continuously shifting. This recording makes sense maybe for a month, and who knows, maybe next time we'll discuss that belonging is actually not the right word for it. So I don't think it's ever perfect to say, like, as a landscape, like looking at things and deciding that this is the final destination. It's like, no, it's continuous. And in terms of the person who you're trying to get to know a little bit better, I would say that, like, is your curiosity, because again, there's ways to find out things about people's backgrounds that isn't an interview, right? The same way that you would just be talking to possibly a Jew who's the similar skin tone as you, and you would just say things like, oh yeah, where were you raised, right? That same cadence of conversation that you would have with another person, that's how you apply it to the same situation. If you're scoping your mind, you're like, how do I say this not offensively? Probably a good sign that maybe right now you're not ready to ask that particular question without causing harm. Because I would hate for this person that your intent is to get closer to this person, and I would hate for the impact being this person withdrawing because they feel ostracized or like pointed at for it. So I think that oftentimes, because again, that's not the intent. The intent is just to have a closer relationship. But how we do that is through making sure that we are prepared to answer these questions and ask these questions without causing harm. And if you're not sure about that quite yet, it might show that you might need to know that person a little bit better before diving into such personal topics.
Sage, thank you so much for this teaching and the modeling. I think everyone on here really, really appreciated your time and your expertise. And I was deeply, deeply touched by everything you said.
Can I just say one last thing that needs to
Sure,
mention?
please.
So thank you. So fun fact about my position, this is my first year at Keshet, and we are trying to build out my next year and what that's going to look like. So what's really important is that we have a little survey that's just a little reflection on how you thought this call went, right? And how you thought this session went, because this helps me both as an educator to figure out what things worked, what things didn't, but it's also really great for our funders to be able to see like the impact of the session. So that way it continues to exist. So I'm going to drop it in the chat right now. So feel free to click the link whenever.
And I will send it out to everyone where we recorded this. So I'll send everybody a link to our YouTube website that will have it on it. And I'll include this link so that you can, I hope that everybody does the survey. The more people that do the survey, the better for all of us. I want to thank again the Jewish Women's Foundation of the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County for their support for this project. And I also want, before everyone leaves, to let you know about a few upcoming events. Keep your eyes posted for information. We're going to have webinars on the Florida reproductive rights ballot measure and, as you can see in the news, the Arizona reproductive rights ballot measure. Look for webinars from us coming up very soon. For those of you in Florida, you will be receiving information from us inviting you and your congregation or group to host a religious freedom Shabbat this fall. And we'll send you more information on that hopefully next month. For those of you in Michigan, I want to personally invite you to our first annual fundraiser on May 5th. If you're not in Michigan, you're still welcome to come, but you might have to travel a little bit. You should receive a reminder email about that shortly. There's also a link that was posted. Know me if you can, post it in the chat again. And that is on May 5th, the fundraiser. There is also a conference in Michigan on white Christian nationalism that we are co-sponsoring on May 3rd. You'll get that in an email from us. So lots happening. Jews for Secular Democracy. We are busy, busy, busy. And we appreciate everyone's support and we appreciate you all for coming tonight. Good night. Have a good night, everybody. And Sage, thank you again.
Of course. Bye.